مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الحياة السياسية في أمريكا منقسمة منذ وقت طويل، ولكن اللحظة الراهنة غريبة، أيمن غرابة. يعيش الأمريكيون حقا في عالمين مختلفين. أحد هذين العالمين يرى أن جو بايدن هو الرئيس المنتخب وينتظر إعلاناته عن المرشحين لحكومته وأفكاره حول السياسات. والعالم الآخر يرى أن دونالد ترامب هو الفائز الحقيقي وينتظر أن تتوجه المحكمة العليا رئيسا لولاياته الثانية. وإذا تجرى كل هذه الأحداث يهاجم الفيروس أعدادا من الناس أكبر من أي وقت مدى، ومسيرة التاريخ مستمرة. مع كل هذه القصص الغريبة ربما لا تكونون قد لاحظتم القصة التي لم تحدث، القصة التي خشي كثير من الناس أن تحدث، وهي القصة التدخل في الانتخابات من قبل الحكومات الأجنبية مثل الصين وروسيا وإيران. ربما لم يحاولوا، ربما حاولوا وفشلوا. مهما يكون السبب، انتخاباتنا لعام 2020 تذكرنا بمقولة شكسبير: مهما تكون التحديات التي واجهتنا خلال انتخاباتنا، فإن الخطأ ليس في نجومنا أو في هذا الحالة خصومنا، وإنما في أنفسنا. لمناقشة مسألة أمن الانتخابات وأثر ذلك على عمليات التصويت في 2020 يسرني أن أرحب بالخبيرين المتميزين تريسا بيتن وريتشارد وايتس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Well, we've had just the most unusual election with conflicts and complaints and allegations of fraud and misconduct. But there's one story that didn't seem to happen, at least not apparently. And that's the story of foreign interference in the election that worried so many people, especially given what happened in 2016. So to talk about the story that didn't seem to happen, I'm delighted to welcome Teresa Payton and Richard Weitz. So thank you for joining us today. Just very briefly, was there a massive effort to interfere with our election in 2020? Teresa.
Well, there was a massive effort. Thankfully, we saw them coming. Many of the different manipulation campaigns coming from foreign interference were spotted, stopped, and as a matter of fact, we had a press conference discussing it in the days leading into the official election day with the Iranian hackers who were sending information, threatening emails to registered Democrats. There was also mention of Russian operatives and manipulation campaigns. But candidly, who needs nation states to manipulate our citizens when we're perfectly capable of doing it ourselves? We have a lot of work that's been done to be ready for 2020, a lot of preemptive strikes that were conducted, and a lot of great work, a lot of successes. But just like 2016, 2018 in America, but also other global elections, we learned in the months after about many of the manipulation campaigns. And so I think we did a really good job. Manipulation campaigns, unfortunately, are here to stay. And we're going to be dealing with the after effects for 2020 in the months and weeks, the weeks and months to come for this particular election, but they're here to stay and will be a part of every future election, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. And Richard, your overall assessment, 2020, a year of great foreign interference or a year in which the bad guys took a break and perhaps planned for something down the road?
I think Teresa got it precisely right, that there was a series of warnings from U.S. government officials with substantial evidence that there were foreign actors trying to interfere in the elections. Russia, China, Iran were named in particular. They cited evidence of this working both through the electoral system at various levels. But we also saw that there was a lot of disinformation, a lot of claims of electoral interference within the U.S. itself among Americans. So that sort of drowned it out as background noise, a lot of what's happening with foreign countries. And she's right that we won't fully know for a while what the foreign actors did and how effective it was, particularly since this was a close election. We want to clearly look into that. And then finally, this is not going to go away. I mean, we're going to be facing this with every election. We saw the Russians achieve some success in what they did in 2016, and the way we reacted, continually calling on them not to do this, continuing raising the profile of this, I think has encouraged other actors to see this as a U.S. strategic vulnerability. And so now we've got more actors involved in this election. I think it's something we're going to have to defend against going forward indefinitely.
So let's provide our viewers some context. Going into this election, we had the experience of 2016. What did that experience show us, and how did we prepare based on the lessons from 2016? Teresa?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about this in my book, Manipulated Inside the Cyber War to Hijack Elections and Distort the Truth. You know, one of the things that we learned was, for starters, many of the nation states who conduct these manipulation campaigns, they're focused first and primarily on meddling in their own country, you know, making sure that they look like they're doing a great job, making sure the citizens at home look at sort of their country and then look at all other countries as, you know, a mess or a dumpster fire. And they perfect these manipulation campaigns at home first, domestically, before they meddle abroad. And they're not just interested in U.S. elections. They're interested in all elections that promote democracy, that promote, you know, different ideals, different from the regime. The other thing that we learned is that these manipulation campaigns, if they're conducted correctly, are actually quite financially lucrative. So the Russians were, in some regards, almost self-funding their operations through clickbait ads. They also had a little cryptocurrency mining scheme to sort of hide their tracks when they were purchasing tools and domain names and accounts and services. So we learned a lot, but most of it was actually in the months after the election was over.
So Richard, when we focus on the three countries that we referred to earlier, China, Russia, and Iran, do they all have the same objectives? Do they all use the same tools, or are they just sort of complementary in how they go about trying to undermine elections around the world?
Right, a great question. I mean, we have, of course, most evidence from the U.S. case, and it's interesting that they all pursued slightly different routes. And in fact, the Russians changed their approach from what they used in 2016. Last time they created false persona. They even sent people to the U.S. to cause problems. This time, they more skillfully relied on amplifying what Americans were saying and projecting them to target audiences. This was more authentic. It harder to hide harder to make evident that this was foreign-based discourse because you were taking Americans speaking to other Americans. And on this occasion, the intervention appeared more aimed to push out some people they were particularly concerned about. So there was apparently efforts to try and get progressives to not vote by, for example, they created a separate website in which they hired Americans to write for. These were progressive leftists, and they would write things saying, well, Trump's terrible, but Biden's just as bad. He's a conservative at heart. So both of them are bad, and that could help hurt the turnout. Apparently, the Chinese had a somewhat different approach. Teresa's perfectly right that the Chinese priority is always to control its own internet. So they want to suppress lines that are at variance with the ruling Communist Party. And in particular, there was concerns about COVID-19, that the local authorities had allowed it to spread within China, and then it contaminated the rest of the world through Chinese misactions. So that was a main theme they were pushing. In terms of what they were doing in the U.S. elections, it was more along the lines of pushing out narratives in local papers, for example, that we really want to sell American, we want to buy American soybeans, we want to sell American products, but these tariffs are interfering with that, so it'd be great to get them removed. The Iranian effort was apparently less sophisticated. They sent out emails to voters in several states claiming to be from a right-wing group that supported Trump, but it quickly became apparent through faults in their coding, and particularly, I guess, they showed a computer screen in the background, a lot of people to identify this was coming from Iran. But I suspect they'll increase this. So it's been a different tactics on all three of them, but they're somewhat complementary. The Russians are moving more towards internal internet controls, following the Chinese model, as are other countries. The Chinese follow the Russian practice. In the past, they would be very focused on pushing out one narrative through their established media, in particular CGTN, and other Chinese state-controlled media. This time, they also use Twitter and other social media, which are banned in China, but useful for their diplomats and foreign outreach.
So it sounds like we were prepared pretty well for what they tried to do this time. Is that correct, Teresa?
They were very well prepared. And, what's interesting, too, is they use the kind of the non-election cycle to actually test out different approaches and frameworks. So a couple of things that I observed is, sort of in the kind of the years leading up to this election, where you would see, even something as kind of straightforward as K-pop groups and their overall popularity was sort of the Gen Z, Gen Y voting set and younger, but kind of their overall popularity on social media can actually be used to actually promote, for and against certain issues globally. But again, sort of with an idea of, kind of making sure that, that Korea is portrayed in a very positive light. So you can see where some of these different test cases have been happening, as well as dabbling in artificial intelligence chatbots, so creating around an issue. And COVID was kind of the perfect storm for many of these nation states, where they would set up these AI chatbots. They would have them arguing on either side of the issue, trying to emulate human behavior so the social media companies and big tech wouldn't shut them down. And then as soon as they were able to engage real humans to start arguing with each other, the chatbots would kind of shut down and go somewhere else to live another day on another issue. So they were definitely better prepared. Again, we were on offense. So the good news is we actually saw a lot of campaigns. We called them out very publicly. There was a lot of awareness done by the FBI, Department of Homeland Security's CISA organization, where they stood up the rumor control. So there was a lot of really great things done on offense in the United States around sort of the sanctity of elections and not falling prey to misinformation and manipulation campaigns. But they're still happening on, whether or not you should take the vaccination and who created the vaccination and what's really in this vaccination against COVID. Where did COVID originate from? Who did a good job? Who did a terrible job? All of these different types of issues, there is definitely nation state, sort of foreign interference on our social discourse.
Wow. All right. When we come back after the break, I'm going to ask you to think about where we go in advance of our next election cycle. What still needs to be fixed, despite all the effort that we've made to prevent foreign interference in our elections. In just a moment. Politics makes great theater, literally. Everyone knows about Hamilton, the musical that redefined contemporary drama with its powerful score, amazing staging, jaw-dropping hip-hop dancing, and remarkable performances. But the show that I love most for fusing a quintessentially American story with riveting personalities and music that you can't get out of your mind first hit Broadway in 1969. I saw it as a young boy on stage just a couple of years later. That show is 1776, the musical of America's founding, the story of how John Adams and Ben Franklin conspired to get Virginian Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence and convince a crotchety, reluctant Continental Congress to make a complete break from Britain. If you want to understand the birth of America and have a fun time along the way, watch the show or rent the movie. You won't be disappointed. Again, our guests today include Teresa Payton. Teresa served as the Chief Information Officer during the President George W. Bush administration. She was the first woman to hold the position of CIO in White House history. The daughter of a U.S. Marine, this winner of Charlotte's Woman of the Year Award lives in that Western North Carolina city with her husband and 3 children. Also joining us is Richard Weitz. Richard is Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute, a prominent conservative think tank here in our nation's capital. Among his many books, he's written extensively on the bad actors, Russia, China, and Iran, who've been involved in trying to affect our election. So let me just ask you, start with Teresa. One of the themes I've been trying to remind our viewers is that in America, elections are not a national or federal affair, even for federal office, that actually we have 50 state elections and hundreds and thousands of local elections. That must complicate the effort, it seems to me, to try to combat the nefarious efforts of foreign governments to undermine our election security. How is that going in this election?
Yeah, I mean, there is something to be said that sometimes you can have security through obscurity, but it also makes it incredibly challenging to manage, kind of the process itself during the elections and then the auditing afterwards, because each state, as you mentioned, is in charge of their elections. There's federal guidance that needs to be followed, and there is federal coordination around threat intelligence sharing, practices, tools that can be used. And a lot of that is provided by the FBI and by the Department of Homeland Security's CISA department. And that work was ongoing. A lot of lessons learned were built into testing out new approaches in the 2018 midterm elections, and definitely trying to get ahead of all of these issues going into 2020. The thing that nobody was able to predict that definitely had an impact on sort of the American psyche going into the polls was being hit by a pandemic, and whether or not people were going to be comfortable standing in line voting on election day, whether they were going to avail themselves of early voting or make the decision that they wanted to do absentee mail-in voting or drop-off ballot voting. And having to account for that in the months leading up to the election, did create a real challenge because it is managed by the states. The one thing that's really critically important for people who, especially on the outside looking in at the United States and saying, well, how did you not know a president on the night of the election? Well, we don't always know the president on the night of the election. This isn't the first time in our history.
So we only have a few seconds left. I just wanted to ask Teresa if you could wave your magic wand and fix one thing along the lines that Richard has been offering these ideas for the future. What is it, the one thing that you would repair, fix, or correct to make sure that we don't have this problem even worse in the future?
I think a very well understood governance structure for from the state's perspective of how they're going to deal with irregularities and report it out to the public. And then a very well understood, incredibly transparent third-party governance of what information, misinformation, and accounts are marked as misinformation, how that's found, how that's remedied for both individuals that are kind of politicians and public figures, as well as for these inauthentic accounts run by nation states and domestic operatives.
All right. Well, we're going to have to stop there. I'm sorry that we can't go even further in this fascinating and important discussion. There really is nothing more important than preserving the sanctity of our elections. And I want to thank you both for helping elucidate this for our viewers abroad. Teresa Payton, Richard Weitz, thank you for joining us on Dakhel Washington. To say we live in uncertain times is an understatement. We have two presidents, one actual, one presumptive, and only one recognizes the other as such. Our nation's health is failing. Nearly 250,000 people are contracting the coronavirus every day, with both hospital rates and mortality rising. Yes, there is promising news about a vaccine, even 2 vaccines, but for the vast majority of Americans, vaccinations are a future prospect, a spring 2021 story, not a present reality, which is a story of the winter of our mass discontent. And then there is the world. We tend to forget that the world is not static. History won't wait for a vaccine. History won't wait for inauguration. Even during less eventful times, stuff happens during the 10-week period of transition between administrations. This is when Iran ultimately decided to release its hostages, waiting for Ronald Reagan to take his oath of office in order to humiliate Jimmy Carter. This is when Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, decided to bequeath to his successor a U.S. relationship with the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, changing decades of American policy. And this is when George H.W. Bush dispatched 28,000 Marines to the war-torn African country of Somalia, leaving his successor, Bill Clinton, the first political military mess of his presidency. And as the 9/11 Commission noted, the abbreviated transition of 2000, cut short because of the legal battle between the Bush and Gore campaigns, aggravated a systemic problem of getting people vetted and confirmed for key national security positions, with the result being that we were less prepared than we normally would have been by the time the hijackers struck that fateful Tuesday morning in September. Somewhere in a bunker in Moscow or Beijing, under a mountain in Iran or North Korea, in a cave in Afghanistan, in some desert camp in the Sahel, or perhaps a rural retreat in Idaho or North Dakota, evil people are plotting to take advantage of this moment to sow fear into the hearts of Americans. To the extent that they tried to undermine our election itself, they failed. But they are persistent, and they may see opportunities in our current split-screen politics. Our politics is important, and we need to play out a process judged as fair and credible by the vast majority of Americans. But we also need to be mature, responsible, and vigilant. Transitions matter. In the best of times, they can make the difference between life and death. And these are most assuredly not the best of times. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تجربة التصويت في انتخاباتنا لعام 2020، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.